One thing that wrestling fans have always loved to see is a great belt design. After all, if this is a prize that the top wrestlers in the industry are fighting over, then it should be something which is beautiful to look at. So whenever a belt comes along that's particularly eye-catching, then audiences rain down love upon it. But which are the best looking belts in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the Winged Eagle version of the WWF title. Yes, if you were asking most fans to name one belt design which stands above all others as the greatest ever, then it would probably be the Winged Eagle version of the WWF title. But then why wouldn't this be the case, as it's a beautiful piece of artwork, one which was instantly beloved by fans as soon as it was first introduced in 1988. Of course, back then the holder of this belt was Hulk Hogan, but he wouldn't be the only person to carry such an iconic design around his waist. No, over the years, others such as Macho Man Randy Savage, Ric Flair, Shawn Michaels, and Bret Hart would also proudly hold on to it. In fact, so synonymous would the Hitman become with the Winged Eagle throughout the mid-90s, for many fans, it's him who they think of first when they think of it, not the Hulkster. Yes, so timeless was this belt and its design. What with it having that iconic eagle spreading its wings on the front faceplate, it made pretty much everyone who ever held it look like a true champion. Unfortunately though, as with all good things, the time of the Winged Eagle would eventually come to an end. And that end came in April of 1998, as it was on the Raw after WrestleMania 14, where he'd won the gold from Shawn Michaels, that Stone Cold Steve Austin would be presented with an all-new belt, one we'll get to in a moment. But even if it was gone now, fan nostalgia for this classic design would remain over the years, with many calling for it to return as the decades went on. And in the end, these fans would get their wish, because at the recent Saturday Night's Main Event revival in December of 2024, WWE would bring the Winged Eagle back for one night only when Cody Rhodes wore it down to the ring, with this being a hugely well-received move by everyone who was watching the show, as it perfectly fit in with the nostalgia-infused tone of the evening. But what of the other belt Steve Austin was awarded in lieu of the Winged Eagle back in 1998? Was that a good design in its own right? Why, yes, it was, and that's exactly why the Big Eagle is our next entry. That's right, the Big Eagle, as fans would come to call it on account of it looking like the Winged Eagle but a bit chunkier and fuller, is also a very well-remembered version of the WWF title in its own right. And the reason for this isn't just because it also looked great, like something a champion would be proud to be seen carrying through the airport with them, but because as well as that, it was around at the peak of the industry. Sure, some will argue that the peak of Hulk Hogan's golden era was a bigger moment culturally, but if you look at the number in terms of TV ratings and merch sales, nothing tops the Attitude Era of the turn of the millennium. And it was during the Attitude Era that the Big Eagle reigned supreme. So because of that then, not only would it spend a significant period of time being carried down to the ring by Stone Cold, probably the most over wrestler the industry had ever seen by this point, but it would also be carried by a who's who of legends of the time. Names like Triple H, Mick Foley, The Undertaker, Kurt Angle, Kane, and of course, The Rock. And with this being the time that pretty much every kid on the planet was watching wrestling again, it meant they all knew exactly who was in possession of it at any given time. Seriously, while it might not look quite as good as the Winged Eagle in some fans' eyes, you could argue that the Big Eagle is even more iconic, purely because of the time period it was around, because everything about the Attitude Era is iconic today. So when you have a belt as good as the Big Eagle, there's no way it wasn't going to get over in the audience's eyes. Like with the Winged Eagle before it though, the time would eventually come for this one to be retired too, and that time would be after it was merged with the WCW World title in late 2001 to create an all-new Undisputed title. Sure, this new belt wouldn't be introduced right away. No, for at least the first few months, Chris Jericho would carry around two belts with him. But once it was decided a new design was needed to represent this new piece of hardware, that would be brought in. Luckily for us though, that particular belt would also look great, enough to where it's our next entry. Yes, the Undisputed title also has a very vocal fan base of people who loved its design, and that's quite simply because it looked great, like a sleeker and more modernized version of what came before, with it still including that iconic eagle on the front faceplate, but now in a less emphasized way, perhaps to show that this was now a merging of both the WWF and WCW belts. So when it was awarded to Triple H in April of 2002 after he won the gold from Chris Jericho, any disappointment fans had over seeing the Big Eagle disappear quickly evaporated as they realized that what they had now was arguably even better. Hell, this was something that looked so good, many wished it could have been the top prize of the Attitude Era. But instead of being around for that period, the Undisputed title would be around for the early years of the Ruthless Aggression Era instead. and that meant it would be right there in front and center, being fought over by the likes of Brock Lesnar, Kurt Angle, and The Undertaker. In fact, so popular would this belt design be, even when it was no longer the Undisputed title on account of it becoming SmackDown exclusive and Raw getting the World Heavyweight title instead, the same look would remain, with it now being simply referred to as the WWE title again. And during that reign, it would have an arguably even greater lineage of holders, with this being the time that it was also held by the likes of JBL and Eddie Guerrero. Yes, cast your mind back to that moment where Latino Heat famously overcame the odds by beating Brock Lesnar at No Way Out 2004, and you'll remember that it was this belt that he held above his head as he jumped into the crowd to be with his people after the match was over. And this isn't the only iconic moment associated with the Undisputed title design. No, there's also that great Iron Man match between the Beast and Kurt Angle on an episode of SmackDown where they fought over possession of it, or the time that it was briefly held by legends from prior eras like The Rock and Hulk Hogan. All of this is to say then, there are plenty of reasons to remember this particular title with fondness. Does this mean we'll ever see it revived, especially in light of the Winged Eagle returning? We suppose it's possible. But before that happens, we expect it's more likely we'll see the return of another belt design instead, one which to many older fans of territorial wrestling represents the greatest design ever, the one, the only, Big Gold Belt. Ah yes, the Big Gold Belt. The title that represented the #1 prize in all of wrestling for a while, as back during the 80s, it was what the National Wrestling Alliance used for their world title. And that meant it would be held by some of the greatest legends to ever lace up a pair of boots, names like Sting, Ric Flair, and many more. Hell, so great would it look with its gigantic gold faceplate announcing from miles away that the champion of the world was coming once WCW was formed out of the ashes of Jim Crockett Promotions during the late 80s, and that company effectively became the new home base of the NWA. The Big Gold Belt would transfer over there instead. Obviously then, this meant a whole host of other great names would get to hold it down in Atlanta, people like Vader. That said, for the most part, it always remained around the waist of the Nature Boy. And because of this, when he left WCW in 1991 while still in possession of it, he'd actually be able to take it over to WWF with him for a brief time, where he paraded it around, all while proclaiming himself to be the real world's champion. As you would expect, however, this did not go down well with WCW management. And so it was that before long, the Big Gold Belt would be back in their possession, and this meant it was still there when that company had their own boom period during the mid to late 90s after the New World Order was formed and Hollywood Hogan came to be its newest holder. But being a part of the rebel group coming in to destroy the company, Hogan had no intention of respecting the history of this particular prize, which was exactly why, after winning it, he'd desecrate it by spray painting a big NWO logo over that famous front faceplate. How would WCW respond to such an outrage? Well, they'd do everything they could to have one of their own win it back, something which eventually happened when Sting toppled the Hulkster at Starrcade 1997. And after that, the Big Gold Belt would be returned to its former glory as it hung around for the rest of WCW's existence, right through to the Invasion, where it was eventually unified with the WWF title. Even then, though, that would not be the end of this title, as when Raw needed a new top prize in 2002, the Big Gold Belt would be brought back again, this time as the World Heavyweight title. And that's the position it would remain in all the way up until it was deactivated once more in 2014, with this period allowing it to be held by a whole host of new legends like John Cena, CM Punk, Batista, and Daniel Bryan, just to name a few. Of course, even before the Big Gold Belt was first introduced as the NWA title way back in 1986 though, it wasn't like the NWA didn't have an equally as great design for their top prize. They were the #1 body in wrestling back then after all. No, back during the 70s and early 80s, they had a design which was equally as cherished by many today, the 10 pounds of gold. That's right, back during the earliest reigns of Ric Flair on top, this was the belt he held. And what a belt it was. In fitting with the name, it looked amazing with its 10 pounds of gold spread out across its various plates which not only let anyone who was looking know that this was the World Heavyweight Championship of the National Wrestling Alliance, but also all the different countries with proud wrestling traditions it represented, places like the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Mexico. Needless to say then, this was the one that every wrestler wanted to win back during the 70s, as to hold it meant you weren't just the champion of a particular territory. No, it meant you were the top guy in the entire industry. someone who the governing body of wrestling could trust to represent them with all the class and dignity you'd expect a champion to have. And that's exactly why it should come as no surprise that the people who held the 10 pounds of gold around their waist represent a who's who of the best the time period had to offer. Seriously, we're not just talking about names like Ric Flair here. No, we're also talking about first ballot Hall of Famers such as Harley Race, Jack Briscoe, Terry Funk, and Dusty Rhodes. Of course, as time went on though and the big gold belt was introduced to much fanfare, it felt very much like this was a design which was going to be relegated to history. That was until it was brought back again in 1993 under controversial circumstances when new champion Shane Douglas threw it down on the ground after winning it, in the process proclaiming himself to be the Extreme Championship Wrestling World Champion instead. Was this a blow to the credibility of the 10 pounds of gold? Sure, but it wouldn't be enough to damage it too much in the long term, as after that it would continue to be the belt used by the NWA as their top prize. Yes, it's true that these were dark times for the brand, and that few really considered it a world title anymore by then, but it would get an unexpected revival in fortunes during the late 2010s, as that was when Billy Corgan bought the National Wrestling Alliance and brought it over to YouTube full time. That said, not every great belt design has to come from a world title. No, some can come from mid-card straps instead, and one of those is our next subject as it happens, the classic 80s and 90s design of the WWF Intercontinental title. You know the design we're talking about here. It's the one that was used in WWF during the Golden Era, back when it was truly the workhorse championship that any real wrestler wanted to hold above all else. And that was exactly why this was the era where it got put around the waists of show-stealing performers like Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Mr. Perfect, and of course, Macho Man Randy Savage. In fact, so in demand would the Classic Intercontinental title be, at one point the Ultimate Warrior managed to come in possession of it while he was in the middle of his meteoric rise. And being the Warrior, he'd be allowed to customize it to give it that famous white strap that so many remember fondly today. For the most part though, it would be the black strap that this incarnation of the mid-card prize had, and it's this version which would mostly later be held by even more legends like Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart, Steve Austin, The Rock, and Triple H. Unfortunately for fans of this design though, by the time the Attitude Era was in full swing, a new version of the belt would be introduced, with this one not having the same sense of magic for many who grew up watching it be the real standout one WWF had in its arsenal. Should it come as a surprise to learn that for years afterwards, fans would demand a return to that classic design? And they weren't the only ones demanding this either, as it happened. No, Cody Rhodes was also a big proponent of reviving that old look when he won the belt in 2011. And in the end, that's exactly what he did, with him not only bringing back the classic version here, but also the version with the white strap to boot. Sure, after this, it would disappear once more, as during the 2000s and 2010s, little to no attention was often given to the Intercontinental title. But thankfully, that would finally change again once Gunther won it in 2022. Does this mean we can hope to see such a design revived once more under this new WWE regime? Given the fact that they just brought back the Winged Eagle, anything is possible. Hell, who knows? Before all is said and done, we might even see the revival of another set of classic Golden Era and early Attitude Era belts, the one which, as fans of the time will fondly remember, once represented the WWF Tag Team titles. Now, the tag team titles have had an up and down history when it comes to designs. After all, many fans dislike the infamous penny belts. But this wasn't always the case for that set of straps, because back in the 80s and 90s, the design they had was held in much better regard. Why was that? Well, they looked just beautiful. Yes, these belts were simple yet elegant, with a front plate which bore the image of that old eagle along with some text to confirm these were for the tag team champions of the world. And the teams who wore these belts over the years certainly looked good with them. Just go back and watch some old footage of the British Bulldogs, the Hart Foundation, or Demolition. And then go on towards the Attitude Era and see how well they sat around the waists of duos like the New Age Outlaws, the Acolytes, and the Hardy Boys. Yes, there's a reason this design hung around for as long as it did, and that reason is there was a certain timeless quality to the tag team titles in the WWF back then. A timeless quality that would somewhat be lost as the years went on and different designs were introduced in their place. Honestly, you can make an argument for these belts being the best designed tag team ones of all time. Sadly though, as the Attitude Era progressed and it was felt like WWF had to continue progressing with the times by shedding any of that old nostalgia of the past, these particular belts would be sent off to pasture, along with other belts we've already mentioned like the Winged Eagle or the Classic Intercontinental title design. Is it finally time for these classic tag title belts to make a return in the future too? After all, there are plenty of duos in current day WWE who we can imagine would love a chance to wear them. We suppose the answer to that question is we'll have to wait and find out, but it wouldn't be unheard of for the WWE to do this. And no, we're not just talking about the Winged Eagle here, rather we're talking about a classic title from the 80s which has periodically reappeared in the decades since. Our next entry as it happens. Which belt design are we talking about? Why, the $1 Million title, of course. Hell, it's one of the most eye-catching designs any wrestling belt has ever had. No, it may not be to everyone's tastes, but for those who love it, it's a true one-of-a-kind, as it forgoes any of the usual things that make up a classic title belt, such as traditional faceplate or any text telling us what it represents. Rather, it's just a gold strap with several diamond-encrusted dollar signs spread across it, with 3 particularly big ones set right there in the middle. Needless to say then, this one was the personal title for the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, with him first introducing it back in 1989 after several failed attempts to get the world title off Hulk Hogan led the heel to just simply commission his own prize. Sure, it was never a belt that was officially sanctioned by WWF or anything, but that didn't matter too much to DiBiase. No, all he was concerned about was how good it looked around his waist, and this was why he would usually be seen wearing it whenever he came down to the ring thereafter. That said, the $1 Million title wasn't always in Ted's possession. No, on occasion it would move over to someone else, either as a result of him losing it to them in a match, as happened when Virgil memorably won it in 1991, or it being passed on to someone else, as happened with Ted DiBiase Jr. in 2010. But whenever this happened, the belt continued to look good regardless of whose waist it was around, as it was still that diamond-encrusted gold prize that perfectly summed up the excess of the era in which it was first introduced. In fact, so long-lasting would this one be, it's even returned to WWE TV as recently as 2021. Yes, this was the point that it became a MacGuffin to be fought over by LA Knight and Cameron Grimes down in NXT. Ultimately though, despite winning this feud and becoming the new $1 Million champion as a result, it would not be Grimes who was in possession of the belt itself once all was said and done. No, the last time we saw it, it was back within the grasp of its original owner again, with this leading us to assume that as things stand today, it remains on Ted DiBiase's shelf, the very place it will likely remain until the time comes for it to be brought back to TV once more. But what about the UK branch of NXT? After all, they had their own belts too. Yes, it's time to talk about the NXT UK titles. Why are we including all of the NXT UK titles in this entry? Well, because they all looked equally as great as each other, and so it doesn't seem fair to pick one over another when deciding on what to include in this video. Now, whether we're talking about the NXT United Kingdom Championship, the NXT UK Women's Championship, or the NXT UK Tag Team Championships, each one looked fantastic. And they all looked pretty similar too, particularly the Men's and Women's World Championships, as they had pretty much the same faceplate, a gold British themed design with a splash of red to highlight the NXT UK logo, with the only real difference being that one had a black strap and the other had a white one. Then there's the NXT UK Tag Team titles. While they were a little different in that their faceplates were a little more circular, the rest of the design was similar enough. Of course, it always helps a belt to look good if there are some great wrestlers holding it, and luckily for the NXT UK titles, there was no shortage of great wrestlers who won them during their all-too-brief history. Seriously, if we're talking about the men's world title, then the people who wore that include the likes of Pete Dunne, Ilya Dragunov, and of course, Walter. And if we're talking about the women's world title, well, that was held by not only Kaylee Ray and Miko Satomura, but also arguably the 2 biggest stars in all of women's wrestling today, Rhea Ripley and Toni Storm. Sure, the NXT UK Tag Team titles might not have quite as impressive of a lineage as that, but they still had an impressive one. After all, when we're talking about belts that were held by the grizzled young veterans, Mustache Mountain, and Pretty Deadly, how could they not? That's right. While they might not have lasted for long, the NXT UK titles certainly made the mark for fans who were watching the show week in and week out, and a big part of the reason they were held in such high regard by those fans was because they looked great around the waist of anyone who was in possession of them at any given moment. But let's move away from WWE and its various brands for a moment again, and back over to the world of WCW instead, as this is where we find our next great belt design. Which one of the many titles that company has had over the years are we talking about here? The 90s version of the United States title, of course. That's right. While there have been many different versions of the United States title which have existed across the years between Jim Crockett Promotions, World Championship Wrestling, and WWE, too many to count in fact, The design most beloved by fans has been the 90s version, and this was the one which was introduced in 1991 after Ivan Koloff destroyed the prior version. And this design does everything it needs to do and more, what with it having a nice gold faceplate adorned with an American flag and some equally as nice side plates showing off some of the grappling that would make the title so well regarded. Unsurprisingly then, given how good it looked, this one would remain in circulation all the way up until WCW went out of business in 2001, and that means it was there through multiple eras of the promotion, including their big mid to late 90s boom period. Who would be some of the people who held it during this time? Well, like with some other belts we've looked at today, it's pretty much a who's who of some of the biggest names of the era. We're talking about people like Sting, Vader, Ric Flair, Diamond Dallas Page, Goldberg, and of course, a young Steve Austin. Yes, before he was the rattlesnake over in WWF, Stone Cold was first cutting his teeth in WCW with this piece of hardware. But then that's what a great mid-card title should do. Help to elevate someone to that next level on their route towards the top. And it always helps these performers get over if the belt looks as good as the 90s version of the United States one did, which is why it's such a shame that when Vince McMahon bought the company out at the dawn of the new millennium, this design would not last much longer. No, once the US title eventually made its full-time return again in 2003, it would be an all-new design that was featured, one which, while it certainly had some charm of its own, wasn't quite as beloved by fans as the prior version had been. But then maybe the fact it eventually went away is part of the reason it's so well remembered today, as absence certainly makes the heart grow fonder. That said, if it were up to us, not only would this one make a full-time return in the present day, but all the belts we've looked at today would, because they each represent some of the greatest designs the industry has ever seen, with all of them proving that a good-looking belt really can make all the difference in the world.